There are moments in life that don't just challenge you, they redefine you. Moments where everything you believed was stable suddenly shifts, where expectations collapse, and where silence becomes louder than words. In those moments, most people expect a reaction: anger, confrontation, or a desperate attempt to hold on. But what if the most powerful response is not what you say, but what you choose not to say? What if losing everything doesn't mark the end of your story, but the beginning of a version of you that is stronger, calmer, and far more in control than before? What if grace under pressure becomes your greatest advantage, and silence becomes your loudest statement? This is not just a story about loss. It's about perspective. It's about how inner strength can remain untouched even when everything external seems to fall apart. It's about the quiet power of acceptance, the discipline of patience, and the unexpected strength that comes from choosing dignity over reaction. Because sometimes, the real victory is not in winning the situation, but in winning yourself. And once you understand that, you realize something powerful. No one can take away your composure, your clarity, or your ability to rebuild your life from nothing. Stay with this story, because what unfolds is not just about what was lost, but about how silence, strength, and self-respect can turn an ending into the beginning of something far greater. Emotional resilience during unexpected life changes is not something that is built overnight. It is revealed when stability disappears and a person is forced to confront uncertainty without preparation. When circumstances shift abruptly, especially in deeply personal situations, the mind initially struggles to accept what has happened. There is confusion, disbelief, and an internal resistance that tries to negotiate with reality. This phase is natural, as the human mind seeks familiarity and control, both of which are suddenly stripped away. What follows is a quiet internal struggle where emotions fluctuate between denial, frustration, sadness, and moments of clarity that come and go without warning. In such moments, emotional resilience begins to form not through avoidance of pain, but through the gradual acceptance that pain is part of the transition. Instead of reacting impulsively, a resilient mindset observes what is happening internally. Thoughts become less chaotic as awareness increases. Rather than allowing emotions to dictate immediate responses, there is a growing ability to pause, reflect, and choose a measured reaction. This pause becomes powerful because it creates space between feeling and action, allowing decisions to be guided by awareness rather than impulse. Resilience also involves redefining what stability means. When external structures change, internal grounding becomes essential. A person begins to rely less on circumstances and more on their own ability to adapt. Confidence is no longer tied to external validation or material security, but to the understanding that survival and growth are still possible regardless of loss. This shift in perspective transforms vulnerability into a source of quiet strength. Over time, resilience is reinforced through small, deliberate actions. Getting through daily routines, making independent decisions, and rebuilding a sense of normalcy all contribute to restoring balance. Even in the absence of certainty, consistency in behavior helps create a foundation that supports emotional recovery. There is also a subtle realization that setbacks, while difficult, do not define the entirety of one's identity, and that continuity of self exists beyond any single event, gradually shaping a renewed sense of inner stability that continues to evolve through experience. The shock of losing material assets in a divorce often arrives in layers rather than all at once, beginning with a cognitive dissonance where what was assumed to be stable suddenly becomes uncertain. Material possessions are not just objects, they are tied to memories, effort, time, and identity, which is why their loss can feel disproportionately heavy compared to their physical value. In many cases, there is an initial phase where the mind attempts to process the outcome logically, replaying conversations, decisions, and expectations that led to the present situation. This mental replay is not just about understanding what happened, but also about trying to find a point where things could have been different, which creates a loop of reflection that can intensify the emotional impact. As the reality sets in, the emotional response often shifts between disbelief and a quiet sense of emptiness. The environment that once felt familiar may now feel altered, not because the physical space has changed immediately, but because the association with ownership and shared history has been disrupted. Items that once symbolized stability may no longer be accessible, and this absence reinforces the sense of loss beyond the tangible level. At the same time, there can be an internal pressure to respond, to react, or to reclaim control through confrontation or explanation, yet the absence of control in the situation can make those impulses feel ineffective or draining. Another dimension of this shock is the perceived imbalance between effort and outcome. When significant time and emotional investment were placed into building a shared life, the redistribution or loss of assets can feel disproportionate, leading to questions about fairness and recognition. This perceived imbalance can temporarily overshadow rational acceptance, as the emotional mind prioritizes the sense of being wronged over objective assessment. However, as time progresses, the intensity of this reaction may begin to soften, allowing space for clearer thinking to emerge. In parallel, there is often a quiet internal adjustment where priorities begin to reorganize. What once seemed essential may start to lose its emotional weight, while intangible aspects such as personal well-being, independence, and mental clarity gain importance. This shift does not eliminate the initial shock, but reframes it within a broader perspective where material loss becomes one part of a larger transition that continues to unfold through adaptation, reflection, and gradual rebuilding of a new sense of normalcy that was previously unimagined, requiring patience, endurance, and a steady reorientation of focus toward what remains and what can still be shaped moving forward without depending on past structures that no longer exist. Maintaining dignity in the face of unfair outcomes is a deliberate choice that reflects internal strength rather than external circumstances, especially when situations feel imbalanced or beyond personal control. When outcomes do not align with expectations, the immediate emotional response can include frustration, disappointment, or a sense of injustice. However, dignity is preserved not by suppressing these emotions, but by managing how they are expressed and ensuring that actions remain aligned with self-respect. In moments where reactions could easily become impulsive, choosing restraint becomes a defining behavior that protects personal integrity. Dignity is closely tied to self-perception, meaning how a person views their own worth regardless of how others behave or what outcomes occur. When faced with unfairness, there is often a temptation to seek validation through confrontation, explanation, or attempts to correct the situation publicly. While these responses may feel justified, they can sometimes escalate tension or shift focus away from personal well-being. Maintaining composure allows an individual to remain centered, avoiding unnecessary engagement in conflicts that may not lead to meaningful resolution. Another important aspect of dignity is the ability to separate external events from internal identity. An unfair outcome does not redefine a person's character, values, or future potential. By recognizing this distinction, emotional stability becomes easier to maintain. Instead of internalizing the situation as a personal failure, it is viewed as a circumstance that requires adjustment rather than self-judgment. This perspective reduces the emotional burden and prevents prolonged self-doubt. In practice, dignity is expressed through calm communication, controlled reactions, and a steady demeanor, even when faced with provocation. Silence, in certain contexts, can be more powerful than immediate response because it demonstrates confidence and emotional control. It reflects an understanding that not every situation requires a reaction, and that preserving inner balance is more important than proving a point in the moment. Over time, consistently choosing dignity reinforces a sense of self-respect that is not easily shaken by external events. It builds a reputation of composure and reliability, not necessarily visible to others in full, but deeply rooted in personal awareness. This quiet strength becomes a stabilizing force, allowing forward movement without being weighed down by the need to justify or defend oneself continuously, creating a mindset that remains steady even when circumstances do not appear to be in one's favor. Acceptance as a form of silent strength is not about surrendering to circumstances or agreeing with outcomes that feel undeserved, but about reaching a mental state where resistance no longer controls emotional energy. In difficult situations, the natural response is often to resist what is happening, to question it repeatedly, and to search for ways to reverse or challenge it. While this reaction is understandable, prolonged resistance can intensify inner conflict and delay the process of moving forward. Acceptance, in contrast, begins when the mind recognizes the limits of control and shifts focus toward what can still be influenced. This form of acceptance develops gradually, often after the initial emotional reactions have been experienced fully. It is not immediate, because the mind needs time to process loss, change, or unexpected outcomes. During this period, thoughts may still return to what was, what could have been different, and what might have been prevented. However, as awareness grows, there is a subtle realization that continuing to replay the same scenarios does not alter the present reality. This recognition allows emotional energy to be redirected from resisting the past to engaging with the present moment. Silent strength lies in the internal adjustment that occurs without the need for external validation or visible acknowledgement. Acceptance does not require announcing agreement or expressing approval. Instead, it manifests as a quiet internal alignment where the individual stops fighting against what cannot be changed. This does not eliminate emotions entirely, but it prevents those emotions from dictating behavior in a way that leads to instability or unnecessary conflict. Another important aspect of acceptance is the clarity it brings. When resistance fades, mental space opens up, allowing for more objective thinking. Decisions become less reactive and more intentional. This clarity helps in identifying practical steps forward, rather than remaining stuck in emotional loops. It also reduces the psychological burden that comes from holding on to unresolved tension, making it easier to focus on rebuilding and adapting to new circumstances. Over time, acceptance strengthens resilience because it trains the mind to respond rather than react. It encourages a mindset that acknowledges reality as it is, without distortion, while still maintaining the ability to shape future outcomes within available possibilities. This balance between acknowledgement and action creates a stable foundation for growth, where energy is no longer consumed by internal resistance, but is instead used constructively to navigate the next phase of life with composure and steady awareness. Letting go of attachment to possessions is one of the most challenging yet transformative experiences a person can undergo, especially when those possessions have been intertwined with identity, memories, and personal achievements. Human beings naturally form emotional bonds with material items because they serve as markers of stability, success, or milestones in life. A home, a car, jewelry, or even intangible assets like financial accounts often carry symbolic weight beyond their practical utility. When circumstances force a person to part with these items, the initial reaction is frequently one of grief, disbelief, or frustration, because the loss feels like a part of oneself is being stripped away. The process of letting go begins with acknowledging the impermanence of material things. No matter how much effort, time, or emotional investment has gone into acquiring them, possessions are external and ultimately beyond complete control. Understanding this distinction between internal value and external ownership shifts the focus from clinging to items toward cultivating personal strength that is independent of circumstance. It is the recognition that self-worth, identity, and potential are not defined by objects, and that losing them does not equate to losing oneself. Letting go also requires reframing one's perception of what is essential. When attachment loosens, it becomes clearer which aspects of life are truly meaningful and enduring, such as skills, relationships, resilience, and personal growth. These are not taken away by external events and cannot be diminished by material loss. By redirecting focus from the external to the internal, a person begins to see freedom and release rather than limitation, discovering that liberation from attachment allows energy and attention to be invested in rebuilding, creating, and evolving. Emotionally, this process involves accepting discomfort without letting it dictate actions. The initial sense of deprivation or unfairness can be strong, but over time, repeated practice in detachment cultivates a steadiness that is both empowering and calming. It trains the mind to observe possessions as tools or symbols rather than extensions of identity. This perspective also allows for a measured response to future challenges, reducing vulnerability to emotional upheaval when unexpected changes occur. Ultimately, letting go of attachment to possessions is an exercise in reclaiming personal sovereignty. It teaches that true security lies not in the accumulation of objects but in the stability of one's own mind and values. By consciously releasing material dependency, a person strengthens the ability to navigate life with composure, resilience, and clarity, transforming what could have been a source of pain into an opportunity for empowerment, self-discovery, and quiet inner freedom. The power of inner peace over external validation lies in shifting the source of stability from outside approval to internal equilibrium, where a person no longer depends on others' opinions, reactions, or judgments to feel secure or complete. External validation is often unpredictable because it is influenced by changing perspectives, circumstances, and biases of others. When a person relies heavily on it, their emotional state can fluctuate based on acceptance, criticism, recognition, or neglect, creating a cycle where self-worth feels dependent on external responses rather than personal conviction. Inner peace, on the other hand, provides a consistent foundation that remains unaffected by these external variations, allowing a person to maintain emotional balance regardless of how situations unfold around them. Developing inner peace begins with self-awareness, the ability to observe one's thoughts and emotions without immediately reacting to them. Instead of seeking reassurance from others to confirm decisions or validate feelings, an individual learns to trust their own judgment and values. This trust is built over time through reflection, experience, and an understanding of personal priorities. As this internal trust strengthens, the need for constant approval gradually diminishes, and decisions become guided by clarity rather than the desire for acceptance. Inner peace also involves detaching from the constant comparison with others, which is often a major driver of external validation-seeking behavior. When attention is focused outward on how others are perceived or what others possess, it creates a subtle sense of lack or inadequacy. By redirecting focus inward, a person becomes more grounded in their own progress and growth, recognizing that fulfillment is not a competition but a personal journey. This perspective reduces unnecessary pressure and allows for a more stable emotional experience. Another important aspect is the ability to remain composed in situations where expectations are not met or recognition is absent. Instead of feeling diminished when appreciation is not received, inner peace allows a person to remain steady, understanding that their value is not determined by acknowledgement from others. This creates emotional independence, where satisfaction comes from alignment with one's own principles rather than external applause. Over time, prioritizing inner peace over external validation leads to greater resilience, as emotional well-being is no longer tied to fluctuating external factors. It fosters confidence that is quiet yet firm, enabling a person to navigate challenges without losing balance, and to move through life with a sense of calm assurance that does not require constant reinforcement from the outside world. Strategic silence instead of reactive confrontation is a conscious approach to handling conflict or emotionally charged situations by choosing restraint over immediate response. In moments where tension arises, the instinctive reaction is often to defend, explain, argue, or correct the situation in real time. While these reactions may feel justified, they are frequently driven by heightened emotions rather than clear thinking. Strategic silence interrupts this impulse, creating a deliberate pause that allows emotions to settle and perspective to become clearer before any action is taken. This form of silence is not passive avoidance but an active decision to withhold response until it is truly necessary or beneficial. It acknowledges that not every situation requires an immediate reply, and that responding too quickly can sometimes escalate misunderstandings or lead to outcomes that are difficult to reverse. By stepping back mentally and refraining from engaging in confrontation, a person preserves emotional energy and avoids being drawn into exchanges that may not lead to constructive results. Strategic silence also serves as a tool for observation. When a person chooses not to react immediately, they gain the opportunity to assess the behavior, intentions, and dynamics of the situation with greater clarity. This observational stance can reveal patterns, motives, or inconsistencies that might be overlooked in the heat of confrontation. With this additional awareness, any future response can be more thoughtful, precise, and aligned with long-term interests rather than short-term emotional impulses. Another important aspect is the psychological effect that silence can have in interactions. When one party refrains from reacting, it can shift the balance of control, as the absence of immediate response often creates uncertainty in the other party. This uncertainty may lead to de-escalation or prompt reconsideration of the situation from a different angle. Silence, in this sense, communicates composure and self-control without the need for verbal explanation, allowing actions, timing, and restraint to convey a sense of confidence. Maintaining strategic silence requires discipline, as it involves resisting the urge to engage when provoked. It is not about suppressing thoughts, but about choosing the right moment and method to express them, if at all necessary. Over time, this practice strengthens emotional regulation, reduces unnecessary conflict, and encourages a more measured approach to communication, where responses are guided by intention and awareness rather than immediate emotional reactions, ultimately supporting a more balanced and controlled way of navigating challenging interactions. Financial independence as a long-term goal represents more than just accumulating money. It is about building a stable foundation that allows a person to make choices without being constrained by immediate financial pressures. When unexpected life changes occur, the absence of financial independence can intensify stress, as decisions become limited by available resources rather than personal preference or strategic planning. By prioritizing financial independence, an individual gradually reduces reliance on external support and gains the freedom to navigate life transitions with greater confidence and flexibility. The journey toward financial independence typically begins with awareness of current financial habits and responsibilities. Understanding income, expenses, savings, and obligations provides clarity on where adjustments can be made. This awareness is not about restriction alone, but about control, ensuring that resources are allocated in a way that supports both present needs and future goals. Over time, consistent financial discipline, even in small measures, contributes to building reserves that can act as a buffer during uncertain periods. Another important aspect of financial independence is developing multiple sources of income or enhancing skills that increase earning potential. Relying solely on a single source of income can create vulnerability, especially in situations where stability is disrupted. Expanding opportunities, whether through career growth, investments, or additional skill sets, helps create a more resilient financial structure. This diversification reduces dependency and allows for adaptability when circumstances change unexpectedly. Financial independence also influences decision-making during emotionally challenging situations. When a person is not financially constrained, choices can be made based on long-term well-being rather than immediate necessity. This reduces the pressure to accept unfavorable conditions out of urgency and allows for more thoughtful and strategic planning. It creates a sense of autonomy where decisions are guided by personal priorities rather than external limitations. Over time, achieving financial independence contributes to a deeper sense of security and confidence. It reinforces the understanding that stability is not entirely dependent on external relationships or shared assets but can be cultivated individually through planning and discipline. This mindset encourages forward thinking, patience, and consistency, all of which play a crucial role in maintaining stability during transitions, while also enabling a person to rebuild, restructure, and move ahead with a clearer sense of direction and control over their future circumstances. Starting over from scratch with confidence is a deeply transformative experience that requires both mental strength and a shift in perspective, especially when circumstances force a person to rebuild their life without the support systems or structures they once relied on. Beginning again from a point of loss can initially feel overwhelming because it involves stepping into uncertainty without the reassurance of familiarity. However, confidence in this context is not derived from having resources or stability already in place, but from the belief in one's ability to create them again through effort, persistence, and adaptability. The process begins with accepting the current reality without resistance, acknowledging that starting over is not a failure but a transition. This acceptance helps clear the mental resistance that often prevents progress, allowing energy to be redirected toward constructive actions rather than being consumed by regret or comparison to the past. Confidence grows when attention shifts from what has been lost to what can be built moving forward, even if progress begins with small and seemingly insignificant steps. Rebuilding from scratch also involves redefining personal priorities. Without previous structures to depend on, a person is encouraged to evaluate what truly matters and what aligns with their long-term vision. This clarity helps in making decisions that are intentional rather than reactive, ensuring that each step taken contributes meaningfully toward stability and growth. Confidence strengthens as these decisions begin to produce results, reinforcing the belief that progress is possible even in the absence of prior advantages. Another important element is developing trust in one's own capabilities. When external support is limited, internal resources such as skills, discipline, and problem-solving abilities become the primary drivers of progress. Each challenge faced and overcome during this phase serves as evidence of resilience, gradually replacing doubt with assurance. Over time, this accumulated experience builds a foundation of self-reliance that becomes more reliable than any external validation or temporary support. Starting over also requires patience, as rebuilding is a gradual process that cannot be rushed without compromising stability. Confidence is maintained by recognizing that progress may not always be immediately visible, yet consistent effort leads to long-term outcomes. This perspective helps in maintaining motivation during periods where results are slow or unclear, ensuring that setbacks are viewed as part of the process rather than indicators of inability, ultimately shaping a mindset that remains steady, focused, and forward-looking despite the challenges of beginning again without predefined advantages. Hidden strength revealed through adversity refers to the discovery of inner capabilities that often remain unnoticed during stable and comfortable phases of life. When circumstances are predictable and secure, there is little pressure to test limits or explore deeper reserves of patience, courage, and adaptability. However, when challenges arise unexpectedly, they disrupt routine and force a person to respond in ways that reveal qualities that were previously dormant or underdeveloped. These moments act as catalysts, bringing forward resilience that may not have been consciously recognized before. Adversity creates an environment where survival, adjustment, and problem-solving become necessary. In such situations, a person is compelled to move beyond familiar coping mechanisms and develop new ways of thinking and acting. This process often involves navigating uncertainty, managing emotional stress, and making decisions without complete information. Through this experience, strengths such as perseverance, emotional regulation, and mental flexibility begin to surface naturally, not because they were newly created, but because the conditions required their expression. Another important aspect of hidden strength is the ability to remain composed when external support is limited. When a person cannot rely on others for immediate assistance or reassurance, they begin to depend more on their own judgment and internal stability. This shift encourages independence and builds confidence in personal abilities. Over time, repeated exposure to difficult situations reinforces the understanding that challenges can be managed, even if the path forward is not immediately clear. Adversity also reveals strength in the form of perspective. Difficult experiences often change how situations are interpreted, reducing the tendency to overreact to minor setbacks and increasing tolerance for uncertainty. This broader perspective allows a person to approach problems with a calmer and more balanced mindset, focusing on solutions rather than becoming overwhelmed by the magnitude of the issue. As these hidden strengths emerge, they contribute to a gradual transformation in self-perception. What was once perceived as vulnerability may be reinterpreted as resilience, and what felt like limitation may become evidence of growth. This realization strengthens inner confidence, as it becomes clear that the ability to endure and adapt was always present, waiting to be uncovered through experience, ultimately shaping a more grounded, capable, and self-aware version of oneself that continues to evolve through each challenge encountered. Avoiding revenge driven by anger is a conscious decision to rise above immediate emotional impulses that often arise in response to hurt, betrayal, or perceived injustice. Anger, while a natural human reaction, can cloud judgment and push a person toward actions that may provide temporary satisfaction but lead to long-term regret or further complications. When emotions are intense, the desire for retaliation can feel justified, as if balancing the scales will restore a sense of control or closure. However, acting on that impulse often keeps a person mentally tied to the very situation they are trying to move beyond. Choosing not to pursue revenge requires a shift in focus from reaction to reflection. Instead of allowing anger to dictate behavior, there is a deliberate effort to pause and assess the situation with a clearer mindset. This pause creates space between feeling and action, enabling decisions to be guided by awareness rather than by emotional intensity. In this space, it becomes possible to recognize that revenge rarely addresses the underlying emotional need for healing, and instead tends to prolong engagement with the source of pain. Avoiding revenge also involves understanding the long-term impact of actions taken in moments of anger. While retaliation may seem satisfying in the short term, it can escalate conflicts, damage personal integrity, and create new problems that extend beyond the original issue. By refraining from such responses, a person protects their own stability and avoids being drawn into cycles of escalation that are difficult to resolve constructively. Another important element is redirecting emotional energy toward personal growth and recovery. Instead of investing time and attention in reacting to past events, the focus shifts toward rebuilding, learning, and strengthening one's own position. This redirection transforms negative emotional energy into motivation for improvement, allowing progress to take place without being hindered by unresolved hostility. Over time, avoiding revenge fosters a mindset grounded in self-control and maturity, it reinforces the understanding that true strength is not demonstrated through retaliation, but through the ability to remain composed under pressure. This approach reduces emotional dependency on external circumstances and encourages a forward-looking perspective where the emphasis is placed on personal well-being, long-term stability, and the ability to move ahead without carrying the burden of anger or the need for retribution, creating a more balanced and controlled way of responding to difficult experiences. Strategic silence instead of reactive confrontation is a conscious behavioral approach that emphasizes restraint, observation, and timing rather than immediate emotional response. In situations where tension, disagreement, or perceived disrespect arises, the instinctive reaction is often to respond quickly in order to defend one's position, clarify misunderstandings, or assert control over the narrative. However, such immediate reactions are frequently influenced by heightened emotional states, which can limit clarity of thought and increase the likelihood of miscommunication or escalation. Strategic silence interrupts this automatic response by introducing a deliberate pause that allows emotions to settle and reasoning to take precedence over impulse. This pause is not equivalent to avoidance or suppression, but rather a controlled decision to withhold response until a more appropriate moment. By choosing not to engage instantly, a person creates mental space to process the situation objectively, evaluate the context, and consider potential outcomes of different responses. This internal distance helps in distinguishing between reactions that are emotionally driven and those that are strategically sound. In many cases, what initially feels urgent to respond to may lose its intensity once viewed with a calmer perspective, reducing the need for confrontation altogether. Strategic silence also serves as a tool for observation. When a person refrains from immediate engagement, they gain the ability to assess not only the situation, but also the behavior and intentions of others involved. This observational stance can reveal underlying patterns, inconsistencies, or motivations that may not be apparent during active confrontation. With this additional understanding, any eventual response can be more precise, measured, and aligned with long-term goals rather than short-term emotional relief. Another dimension of strategic silence is its effect on interpersonal dynamics. In interactions where one party expects a reaction, the absence of immediate response can alter the perceived control of the situation. Silence can introduce uncertainty, prompting the other party to reconsider their approach or reduce the intensity of their behavior. It communicates composure without verbal expression and demonstrates an ability to remain steady under pressure. This non-reactive stance often carries more weight than words delivered in haste. Maintaining strategic silence requires discipline and self-awareness, as it involves resisting the urge to respond in moments of provocation. It is a practiced behavior that strengthens over time, gradually improving emotional regulation and decision-making. By consistently applying this approach, a person becomes more intentional in communication, selecting responses based on clarity and purpose rather than immediate emotional triggers, leading to interactions that are more controlled and less driven by impulsive exchanges. The psychological impact of loss is a complex and deeply personal experience that affects both the emotional and cognitive aspects of a person's mind. When something significant is lost, whether it is a relationship, stability, or a sense of security, the mind undergoes an adjustment period where it attempts to process the change and reconcile it with previous expectations. This adjustment does not happen instantly but unfolds gradually as the individual moves through different emotional states, such as denial, confusion, sadness, and acceptance. At the initial stage, there is often a sense of disbelief where the mind struggles to align reality with what was previously assumed to be permanent. This disconnect can create a feeling of disorientation, as familiar reference points are no longer applicable. Thoughts may repeatedly return to the circumstances surrounding the loss, as the brain attempts to make sense of what occurred and identify possible reasons or patterns. This mental repetition is a natural part of processing, although it can sometimes intensify emotional discomfort when left unchecked. Emotionally, the impact of loss can manifest as a combination of emptiness, frustration, or even numbness. These feelings may fluctuate depending on the individual's coping mechanisms and support systems. In some cases, emotional responses are expressed outwardly, while in others they remain internalized, creating a quiet but persistent sense of heaviness. The intensity of these emotions often depends on the level of attachment that was formed prior to the loss, as stronger attachments tend to produce deeper emotional reactions when disrupted. Cognitively, the mind may experience difficulty concentrating or making decisions during the period following a loss. Attention can become fragmented as thoughts are divided between present responsibilities and reflections on the past. This can temporarily affect productivity and clarity, as mental energy is partially consumed by processing unresolved emotions. Over time, however, the mind gradually adapts by reorganizing priorities and establishing new patterns of thinking that accommodate the changed circumstances. An important aspect of navigating the psychological impact of loss is the gradual shift toward acceptance. This does not imply forgetting or dismissing what was lost, but rather reaching a state where the individual acknowledges the reality of the situation without resisting it. As this acceptance develops, emotional intensity begins to stabilize, allowing for clearer thinking and more balanced responses to everyday situations, creating space for recovery, adjustment, and eventual forward movement, without being constantly anchored to the initial experience of loss. Reclaiming personal identity after separation is a process of rediscovering who a person is outside the roles, expectations, and shared structures that previously defined their life. During a close partnership, aspects of individuality can gradually become intertwined with shared responsibilities, routines, and decisions, sometimes leading to a subtle blending of identities. When separation occurs, this structure dissolves, leaving behind a space where personal identity must be re-established independently. This transition can initially feel disorienting because familiar reference points that once guided daily life are no longer present. In the early stages, there is often a period of reflection where a person begins to question preferences, values, and goals that may have been set aside or influenced by the shared environment. Activities, interests, and aspirations that were once secondary can regain importance as the individual reconnects with aspects of themselves that were previously less visible. This exploration is not about creating a completely new identity, but about rediscovering elements that were always present, but perhaps not fully expressed. Reclaiming identity also involves rebuilding a sense of autonomy in decision-making. Without shared input, choices become entirely personal, requiring a renewed trust in one's own judgment. This shift encourages independence and reinforces the ability to navigate life without external validation or consensus. As decisions are made and outcomes are experienced, confidence in personal instincts gradually strengthens, contributing to a clearer and more stable sense of self. Another important dimension is emotional realignment. Separation can leave behind emotional associations tied to shared experiences, routines, and environments. Detaching from these associations allows a person to redefine their emotional boundaries and establish a sense of individuality that is not dependent on past connections. This process often requires time and patience, as emotional habits formed over an extended period do not dissolve immediately. Over time, reclaiming personal identity leads to a renewed understanding of individuality that is both independent and self-defined. The person begins to recognize their own values, boundaries, strengths, and preferences without filtering them through shared perspectives. This clarity supports personal growth, as it allows for the development of goals and directions that are aligned with individual aspirations rather than collective expectations, ultimately resulting in a stronger, more self-aware sense of identity that continues to evolve through experience and self-reflection. Turning setbacks into motivation involves shifting the interpretation of difficult experiences from obstacles into catalysts for growth. When a person encounters a setback, the immediate response is often emotional, marked by disappointment, frustration, or even discouragement. These reactions are natural because setbacks challenge expectations and disrupt planned progress. However, the way these experiences are processed determines whether they become limiting factors or sources of renewed determination. The first step in transforming a setback into motivation is acknowledgement. Instead of avoiding or minimizing what has happened, the situation is recognized as it is, without distortion. This honest recognition allows the mind to assess the impact clearly and identify the areas that require adjustment. By understanding the nature of the setback, a person can begin to separate emotional reactions from practical considerations, creating a foundation for constructive thinking. Once acknowledged, the setback can be reframed as feedback rather than failure. Every setback contains information about what did not work, which can be valuable for future decisions. This perspective shifts focus away from self-criticism and toward analysis and learning. Instead of viewing the situation as a final outcome, it becomes part of an ongoing process where adjustments and improvements are possible. This reframing reduces the emotional weight of the experience and opens the door to forward movement. Motivation grows when energy is redirected from dwelling on the setback to taking actionable steps. Even small actions can create momentum, helping to rebuild confidence and restore a sense of control. As progress is made, no matter how incremental, it reinforces the belief that improvement is achievable. This gradual rebuilding process helps replace feelings of stagnation with a sense of purpose and direction. Another important element is maintaining perspective. Setbacks are often temporary and limited in scope, even if they feel significant in the moment. By viewing them within the broader context of long-term goals, it becomes easier to see them as part of a larger journey rather than as defining moments. This perspective prevents setbacks from overshadowing overall progress and helps maintain focus on continued development. Over time, consistently turning setbacks into motivation strengthens resilience and adaptability. It cultivates a mindset that approaches challenges with curiosity rather than fear, and persistence rather than avoidance. Each setback then becomes an opportunity to refine skills, adjust strategies, and deepen understanding, ultimately contributing to personal growth and reinforcing the ability to move forward with determination and clarity despite obstacles encountered along the way. The importance of self-worth beyond assets lies in recognizing that a person's value is not determined by what they own, but by who they are at their core. Material possessions, financial status, and external symbols of success can change over time due to circumstances that are often beyond personal control. When self-worth becomes tied to these external factors, it creates a fragile sense of identity that can be easily shaken when those factors are altered or removed. In contrast, grounding self-worth in internal qualities such as character, resilience, integrity, and personal growth creates a more stable and enduring sense of identity that remains intact regardless of external conditions. Developing this perspective begins with understanding the difference between ownership and identity. Assets may contribute to comfort or convenience, but they do not define the essence of a person. Skills, experiences, values, and the ability to adapt carry far more significance in shaping long-term self-perception. When individuals begin to separate their identity from their possessions, they reduce the emotional impact that comes from changes in material circumstances. This separation allows them to navigate transitions with greater clarity, as their sense of self is not dependent on maintaining a particular level of external success. Another important aspect is the role of internal validation. When self-worth is anchored internally, confidence is derived from personal standards rather than external comparisons or recognition. This means that achievements are appreciated without becoming the sole measure of value, and setbacks are viewed as part of growth rather than indicators of inadequacy. This internal framework provides consistency, as it does not fluctuate based on changing external environments or the opinions of others. Embracing self-worth beyond assets also encourages a more balanced outlook on life. It shifts focus toward personal development, relationships, and experiences that contribute to long-term fulfillment rather than short-term appearances. This perspective fosters a deeper sense of contentment, as satisfaction is no longer tied exclusively to accumulation but to progress, learning, and the ability to maintain composure through varying circumstances. Over time, this understanding builds emotional independence and resilience. A person becomes less vulnerable to the instability of external factors and more aligned with their own values and principles. This creates a sense of inner security that supports decision-making, encourages steady growth, and reinforces the realization that true worth is inherent and cannot be diminished by the loss or absence of material possessions, ultimately allowing for a more grounded and confident approach to life regardless of changing external conditions. Growth that comes from hardship is a process in which difficult experiences act as catalysts for personal development, shaping resilience, awareness, and strength in ways that comfort and stability often cannot. When a person goes through challenging circumstances, they are pushed outside familiar routines and forced to confront emotions, decisions, and realities that may have previously been avoided or taken for granted. This disruption creates an environment where learning becomes not just optional, but necessary for survival and progress. In the beginning, hardship often brings discomfort, uncertainty, and a sense of instability. These feelings can be overwhelming, as they challenge existing beliefs and expectations about how life should unfold. However, Within this discomfort lies the opportunity for reflection. A person begins to examine their responses, thought patterns, and behaviors more closely, identifying areas where growth is needed. This self-examination is a crucial step, as it transforms reactive experiences into intentional learning moments. As time progresses, the experience of hardship encourages adaptability. Situations that once seemed manageable under stable conditions now require new approaches and perspectives. This need to adjust fosters creativity and problem-solving and strengthens the ability to navigate uncertainty. With each challenge faced, confidence gradually builds, not from the absence of difficulty, but from the repeated realization that difficulties can be managed and overcome. Another important aspect of growth through hardship is the development of emotional maturity. Difficult experiences often require patience, restraint, and the ability to process complex emotions without being overwhelmed by them. Over time, this leads to improved emotional regulation, where reactions become more measured and less impulsive. This maturity also enhances interpersonal interactions, as a person becomes more understanding of both their own emotions and those of others. Hardship also helps clarify priorities. When confronted with limitations or losses, it becomes easier to distinguish between what is essential and what is secondary. This clarity often results in a more focused and intentional approach to life, where energy is directed toward meaningful goals rather than distractions. Ultimately, growth that comes from hardship is not immediate, but gradual and cumulative. Each challenge contributes to a deeper understanding of oneself and one's capabilities. What initially appears as a setback can, over time, become a defining moment of transformation, strengthening character, expanding perspective, and building a foundation of resilience that supports future experiences with greater confidence, awareness, and stability, allowing a person to move forward with a stronger sense of purpose, shaped by what they have endured and learned along the way. Observing others underestimate your calmness refers to the situation where a person remains composed in circumstances where others expect visible emotional reactions, and this calm demeanor is often misinterpreted as weakness, indifference, or lack of awareness. In reality, maintaining calmness in challenging situations requires a significant level of emotional control and self-discipline, as it involves consciously choosing not to react impulsively despite internal pressures or external provocations. When this composure is not outwardly expressive, it can lead others to form assumptions that do not reflect the individual's actual mental state or capabilities. People often rely on visible cues such as tone, expressions, and immediate reactions to assess how someone is responding to a situation. When these cues are minimal or neutral, it may create a perception that the person is disengaged or unaware of the gravity of the situation. However, calmness can indicate the opposite, suggesting that the individual is processing information internally, maintaining awareness, and choosing a measured approach rather than reacting on impulse. This internal processing allows for clearer thinking and more deliberate decision-making, which can be overlooked by those who expect immediate outward responses. Being underestimated in this way can sometimes work to one's advantage. When others assume that calmness equates to passivity, they may not anticipate strategic thinking or the ability to respond effectively when the time comes. This can create a subtle shift in dynamics, where the individual has the opportunity to assess situations without drawing attention to their intentions or plans. The absence of visible reaction can preserve focus and reduce unnecessary interference from others, allowing actions to be taken with greater precision and timing. Maintaining calmness also reflects a level of emotional independence. It demonstrates that a person is not easily influenced by external pressures or attempts to provoke a reaction. This stability can be developed through self-awareness and practice, where the individual learns to observe their emotions without being controlled by them. Over time, this creates a consistent pattern of behavior that remains steady, even in unpredictable or stressful situations. While others may interpret calmness differently, the individual experiencing it understands the internal effort required to maintain that state. It is not an absence of feeling but a controlled expression of it, where responses are guided by intention rather than reaction. This quiet strength, though not always recognized externally, plays a crucial role in maintaining clarity, stability, and effectiveness in situations that demand thoughtful and composed engagement, allowing a person to navigate complex circumstances with a level of control that is often underestimated by those observing from the outside. Patience as a silent weapon represents the ability to remain composed, steady, and deliberate in situations where immediate reaction might seem natural but is not necessarily beneficial. In moments of uncertainty, pressure, or conflict, there is often an internal urge to act quickly in order to resolve discomfort or assert control over the situation. However, patience introduces a deliberate pause that allows a person to step back mentally, assess circumstances more clearly, and avoid decisions driven purely by emotion. This form of patience is not passive waiting, but an active state of awareness. While externally it may appear as inaction, internally it involves observation, reflection, and mental preparation. By resisting the impulse to respond immediately, a person gains the advantage of time, which can reveal additional information, clarify intentions, or naturally shift the dynamics of the situation. This extended perspective often leads to more informed and effective decisions as actions are taken with a fuller understanding rather than based on incomplete or immediate impressions. Patience also plays a critical role in emotional regulation. In challenging moments, emotions can intensify quickly, making it difficult to maintain clarity. By choosing patience, a person creates space between the emotional trigger and the response, allowing feelings to settle before translating them into action. This separation reduces the likelihood of reactive behavior that may escalate conflict or create unintended consequences. Over time, this practice strengthens the ability to remain balanced even when circumstances are unpredictable or stressful. Another important aspect of patience as a silent weapon is its influence on long-term outcomes. Many situations require sustained effort, consistent behavior, and gradual progress rather than immediate results. Patience enables a person to stay focused on the broader objective without becoming discouraged by temporary delays or setbacks. It encourages persistence, ensuring that actions are aligned with long-term goals rather than short-term reactions. Patience also communicates confidence without the need for verbal expression. Remaining steady in the face of pressure can signal control, awareness, and self-assurance. This quiet demeanor often shifts how others perceive and interact with the individual, as it reflects an ability to remain unaffected by urgency or provocation. Through consistent practice, patience becomes an internal strength that supports thoughtful decision-making, emotional stability, and strategic action. It transforms moments of potential impulsivity into opportunities for clarity and control, allowing a person to navigate complex situations with composure, while maintaining focus on outcomes that require time, discipline, and careful judgment to achieve effectively. Planning quietly for a stronger future involves a deliberate and often discreet approach to rebuilding stability, direction, and confidence without drawing attention to one's intentions or progress. After experiencing disruption or change, there is a natural need to regain a sense of control, and this is often achieved not through immediate visible action, but through careful internal preparation and thoughtful planning. Quiet planning allows a person to assess their current situation honestly, identify gaps, and begin constructing a path forward in a way that is steady, realistic, and sustainable. This process begins with reflection on past experiences, not as a means of dwelling on what went wrong, but as a way to extract lessons that can inform future decisions. By analyzing previous outcomes, patterns become clearer, helping to avoid repeating the same mistakes. This reflective stage is essential because it provides the insight needed to set more informed and achievable goals. Rather than reacting impulsively to circumstances, planning quietly encourages a measured approach where each step is considered in relation to long-term objectives. Another important aspect of quiet planning is focusing on personal development. This may include improving skills, building financial stability, strengthening emotional resilience, or expanding knowledge. These efforts are often carried out without external validation or announcement, allowing progress to unfold at a pace that is not influenced by outside expectations. By concentrating on internal growth, a person builds a stronger foundation that supports future stability, making them better prepared for opportunities or challenges that may arise. Quiet planning also involves managing resources wisely. Whether it is time, energy, or finances, careful allocation ensures that efforts are directed toward meaningful outcomes rather than scattered across unproductive activities. This disciplined approach helps create consistency, which is a key factor in achieving long-term success. Small, repeated actions accumulate over time, gradually transforming intentions into tangible results. Maintaining discretion during this process provides additional advantages. It reduces external pressure, limits unnecessary interference, and allows a person to focus fully on their own progress without comparison or distraction. This privacy creates a space where growth can occur organically, guided by personal priorities rather than external opinions. Over time, planning quietly for a stronger future builds confidence through preparation rather than proclamation. It reinforces the understanding that progress does not need to be visible to others in order to be meaningful. As plans develop and take shape internally, a person becomes more equipped to handle future situations with clarity, stability, and purpose, ensuring that when action is eventually taken, it is grounded in careful thought, readiness, and a well-constructed foundation that supports sustained progress forward. The contrast between expectation and reality often becomes most apparent during significant life events, where assumptions about outcomes, behavior, or fairness do not align with what actually occurs. Expectations are typically formed based on prior experiences, personal beliefs, emotional investment, and sometimes idealized versions of how situations should unfold. These expectations create a mental framework that guides anticipation and shapes emotional readiness. When reality does not match this framework, the resulting gap can lead to surprise, disappointment, confusion, or even a reevaluation of previously held assumptions. This contrast begins with the internal narrative that develops before an event or outcome takes place. The mind tends to construct scenarios that feel reasonable or desirable, often influenced by hope, trust, or perceived stability. These imagined outcomes can create a sense of certainty, even when the actual situation remains uncertain. When reality presents a different result, the mind must quickly adjust, attempting to reconcile the difference between what was anticipated and what has actually occurred. Emotionally, this mismatch can trigger a range of reactions. There may be a moment of disbelief as the mind struggles to accept the unexpected outcome. This is often followed by an attempt to understand why the difference exists, which can lead to reflection on past decisions, assumptions, or interpretations. The intensity of the emotional response often depends on how strongly the original expectations were held and how significant the outcome is perceived to be in relation to personal goals or values. Cognitively, the contrast between expectation and reality encourages reassessment. It prompts a person to question the basis of their assumptions and to recognize where miscalculations or incomplete information may have influenced their outlook. This process, while sometimes uncomfortable, plays an important role in developing more accurate perceptions in the future. By analyzing the gap, a person gains insight into how expectations are formed and how they can be adjusted to better align with actual conditions. Over time, repeated experiences of this contrast can lead to a more balanced approach to expectations. Instead of relying heavily on assumptions, individuals may begin to adopt a mindset that remains open to multiple possible outcomes. This flexibility reduces the emotional impact of unexpected results and supports adaptability. As a result, the ability to manage differences between expectation and reality becomes a valuable skill, helping to maintain composure, improve decision-making, and foster a more realistic and grounded perspective when navigating uncertain situations that do not always unfold as originally imagined. Emotional detachment from material loss is the ability to experience a sense of balance and stability, even when possessions, financial assets, or external resources are reduced or removed. This does not mean a lack of care or awareness about material things, but rather a shift in how much emotional weight is assigned to them. When a person is deeply attached to material assets, their sense of security and identity can become closely linked to ownership, making any loss feel personal and destabilizing. Emotional detachment, in contrast, creates a buffer that allows a person to acknowledge loss without allowing it to define their overall sense of self or disrupt their inner equilibrium. This detachment begins with understanding the temporary nature of material possessions. Assets can be acquired, changed, or lost due to circumstances that are often beyond complete control. Recognizing this impermanence helps reduce the expectation that material stability will always remain constant. When this expectation is adjusted, the emotional reaction to loss becomes less intense, as the mind is already prepared for the possibility that change is a natural part of life rather than an exception. Another important aspect of emotional detachment is the separation between external ownership and internal identity. A person who is emotionally attached to possessions may unconsciously equate what they own with who they are. By consciously distinguishing between the two, it becomes easier to maintain a sense of identity that is independent of material conditions. This internal grounding allows a person to retain confidence and self-respect even when external circumstances shift. Emotional detachment also involves managing reactions to loss in a controlled manner. Instead of responding with prolonged distress or resistance, the individual acknowledges the situation and focuses on adapting to the new reality. This does not eliminate emotions, but it prevents them from becoming overwhelming or dictating behavior. By maintaining composure, a person can think more clearly, make rational decisions, and begin the process of rebuilding without being hindered by excessive emotional disturbance. Over time, practicing emotional detachment strengthens resilience. It reduces dependency on external factors for stability and encourages reliance on internal resources such as adaptability, problem-solving, and perspective. This creates a more balanced outlook where material loss is viewed as a change in circumstance rather than a loss of personal value, allowing the individual to move forward with clarity, steadiness, and a reinforced understanding that inner stability is not dependent on external possessions, but on the ability to remain grounded regardless of changing conditions. Reinvention of life after collapse refers to the process of rebuilding one's personal, emotional, and practical world after experiencing a significant disruption that alters previous plans, relationships, or stability. When a life structure that once provided direction and familiarity suddenly falls apart, it creates a void that can initially feel overwhelming. This collapse may involve changes in living conditions, financial standing, social dynamics, or personal identity, all of which contribute to a sense of disorientation as the individual adjusts to an unfamiliar reality. The process of reinvention begins with acknowledging that the previous chapter has ended. This acknowledgement is not about denying the past or disregarding its importance, but about accepting that continuing to operate with. When a reaction is not given, it removes the immediate reinforcement that often fuels further escalation. In situations where confrontation is expected, non-reactivity can de-escalate tension by not contributing additional emotional energy. This creates a different interaction environment, where the absence of reaction becomes more noticeable than any response might have been. As a result, the focus shifts from provoking a reaction to understanding why no reaction is being offered. Non-reactivity also reflects a level of self-control that may not be immediately visible but is internally significant. It demonstrates the ability to regulate impulses and prioritize thoughtful responses over spontaneous ones. This control can lead to more deliberate communication when a response is eventually given, as it is no longer driven by immediate emotional pressure but by considered judgment. Over time, consistently practicing non-reactivity can influence how others engage in interactions. When predictable reactions are no longer guaranteed, assumptions about behavior begin to change, and interactions may become more measured. The individual who maintains this approach remains centered, unaffected by external attempts to provoke a response, and able to navigate situations with a steady and composed presence that introduces an element of unpredictability, not through randomness, but through intentional restraint and controlled awareness that shapes outcomes in subtle yet meaningful ways. Inner victory versus external defeat highlights the distinction between how a situation appears on the outside and how it is experienced and processed within a person's mind. External defeat refers to visible outcomes that may seem unfavorable, such as loss, rejection, or failure in a particular circumstance. These outcomes are often measured by societal standards or observable results, which can create the impression that a person has been overcome by the situation. However, inner victory exists on a different level, one that is not dependent on external validation, but on internal alignment, self-control, and emotional stability. Inner victory is achieved when a person maintains composure, self-respect, and clarity despite facing outcomes that are not in their favor. It reflects the ability to remain grounded, without allowing external circumstances to disrupt one's internal balance. Even when situations unfold contrary to expectations, the individual retains control over their thoughts, responses, and perspective. This control prevents external events from defining their sense of identity or diminishing their confidence. The contrast between inner victory and external defeat becomes more evident in how a person responds to challenging situations. While external defeat may suggest loss in a tangible sense, inner victory focuses on how that loss is interpreted and managed internally. A person who achieves inner victory does not necessarily avoid difficulty, but instead navigates it with awareness and restraint. This approach allows them to process experiences without being overwhelmed by emotional reactions or drawn into unnecessary conflict. Another important aspect is the long-term perspective. External defeat is often temporary and limited to a specific context, while inner victory contributes to lasting personal strength. By maintaining inner stability, a person ensures that one setback does not define their entire trajectory. Instead, it becomes one part of a broader journey where learning, adaptation, and growth continue to shape future actions. Inner victory also reinforces self-trust. When a person realizes that they can remain steady regardless of external outcomes, it builds confidence in their ability to handle future challenges. This confidence is not based on avoiding failure, but on the understanding that their internal state remains within their control even when external circumstances do not. Over time, the recognition of inner victory over external defeat fosters a mindset that prioritizes resilience, clarity, and self-mastery. It shifts the focus from seeking validation through outcomes to maintaining integrity in the face of them, allowing a person to move forward with a sense of quiet strength that is not diminished by external conditions, but reinforced through the ability to remain composed, aware, and consistent regardless of how situations unfold around them. A quiet ending of a chapter with grace and control represents the ability to conclude a significant phase of life in a composed and dignified manner, without allowing emotions such as anger, regret, or resentment to dominate the transition. When a chapter comes to a close, especially one that has been deeply meaningful or emotionally invested, it is natural for there to be a mixture of feelings. These may include sadness over what has ended, reflection on what was experienced, and uncertainty about what lies ahead. However, choosing to end a chapter with grace means acknowledging these emotions without being consumed by them. Grace in this context is reflected in acceptance. Instead of resisting the conclusion or attempting to alter what has already reached its natural end, there is a conscious recognition that continuation is no longer aligned with the current reality. This acceptance allows the individual to release attachment to the past without diminishing its significance. It creates a sense of closure that is internal, rather than dependent on external validation or resolution from others. Control plays an equally important role in this process. It involves managing reactions, maintaining composure, and ensuring that decisions made during this transition are guided by clarity rather than impulsive emotion. By exercising control, a person avoids actions that could complicate the situation further or create additional emotional burden. This measured approach supports a smoother transition, allowing the individual to step away from the chapter without unnecessary conflict or unresolved tension. Ending a chapter with grace also involves reframing the experience as part of a broader journey. Instead of viewing the conclusion as purely an end, it is understood as a progression toward a new phase. The experiences, lessons, and insights gained during that chapter remain valuable and contribute to personal growth moving forward. This perspective transforms closure into a meaningful transition rather than a loss that defines the future. Over time, approaching endings with grace and control strengthens emotional maturity. It builds the ability to handle transitions without disruption, ensuring that each phase of life is acknowledged, completed, and released in a balanced manner. This approach allows a person to move forward without carrying unresolved emotional weight, maintaining a steady mindset that supports clarity, resilience, and readiness for new beginnings that emerge after one chapter concludes and another begins naturally. In conclusion, this entire journey reflects the quiet but powerful truth that real strength is not always visible in reactions, possessions, or outcomes, but in how a person chooses to respond when everything changes. What may appear as loss on the outside can become a turning point on the inside, where clarity replaces confusion, composure replaces chaos, and self-worth rises above external circumstances. Each key idea highlights a different layer of resilience: acceptance, emotional control, patience, silence, and inner peace, all working together to shape a mindset that is grounded, steady, and forward-looking. True victory is not measured by what is taken or what remains, but by the ability to stand firm without losing identity, dignity, or direction. When expectations collapse and reality takes a different path, the ability to adapt, rebuild, and move forward with grace becomes the greatest form of power. Life may remove familiar structures, but it also creates space for reinvention, growth, and a stronger sense of self that is not dependent on external validation or material stability. Good luck on your journey ahead. May you find strength in moments of uncertainty, clarity in moments of confusion, and confidence in every step you take forward. May every ending guide you toward a stronger beginning, and may you continue to grow with resilience, purpose, and quiet determination. Thank you for being part of this journey and for giving your time and attention to these words.